They say London was the heart of the empire. But if you were sleeping under its bridges, you'd feel more like you were at the edge of the world. Forget the paintings of gentlemen in top hats strolling the streets or ladies stepping into carriages. That was a thin layer on the surface. Peel it back, and you'd find the cold stone, the soot, and the restless bodies of people like me, living without a roof in the city that never truly slept. I'd wake up before dawn, though wake up might be the wrong phrase. You don't really sleep when you're cold on a wooden bench in Covent Garden or tucked into the corner of a damp alley near Whitecap. Elm. The night air was thick with fog that clung to your clothes, mingling with the smoke from chimneys and the sour smell of the Thames at low tide. My bones ached from the cold, my stomach from hunger. You learned quickly to rise before the city fully stirred. Shopkeepers didn't want you in sight when customers arrived, and the police, the peelers, were always ready to prod you along with a stick. You'd stand, joints stiff, brushing off the soot from your coat, trying to look like you belonged somewhere. Anywhere the day's work, if you could call it that, was a hunt. Sometimes you queued outside the workhouse, that great, echoing building that promised a roof and a crust of bread in exchange for hours of punishing labor. But the workhouse stripped you of more than your rags. It stripped you of your name, your dignity. Men were shaved, clothes taken, families separated. And so, you hesitated, because even a night under the arches of Charing Cross felt freer than the rules of the poor law. Food came from luck, charity, or cunning. A church might serve soup to the needy, but the queue was long and the pot small. The smell of roasting chestnuts from a street vendor could break you inside, because you knew a penny was too much to ask. Sometime you'd dive into the back of a market at the right moment, hoping to snatch a bruised apple or a crust discarded by the baker. The streets were not quiet. Even in the smallest hours, the clip of hooves on cobblestone mixed with the drunken singing of sailors, the cry of the watchman, and the shuffle of other souls like me, searching for a safe shadow. The danger was not only in the cold or hunger, it was in the company you kept. A blanket could be stolen from you while you slept. You could be beaten for the few coins in your pocket, or for no reason at all. And yet, there was a strange community among us, an unspoken brotherhood of those the city forgot. We shared fires in abandoned yards, stories told in whispers about who we were before, a carpenter, a soldier, a seamstress, and who we might be again, if fortune ever turned. Winter was the true test. Frost clung to the edges of the city like a living thing. Your breath came in cloud. Fingers cracked and bled. If you could not find shelter, a stable, a church porch, the flattest spot beneath a bridge, you would simply vanish, as so many did, into the frozen ground of pauper's grave. No name, no stone, just a number in a ledger. People think of Victorian London as gaslight and romance, as Dickens' Christmas stories and grand industrial progress. But for the homeless, it was a constant negotiation with survival. One meal, one night, one breath at a time. When you picture that city of progress and empire, remember the shadows, too. Remember the ones who walked its streets without a home, whose only legacy was the sound of their footsteps on a cold, foggy morning. If you've listened this far, I'd like to know, could you have survived a night in my boots? Comment where in the world you're listening from, and maybe subscribe for more stories like this. The past is never as far away as it seems. When I think of Victorian London, it's hard not to recall the images so many novels and paintings have left her. Streets lit by rows of gas lamps, gentlemen in top hats chatting calmly in front of bookshops, ladies in impeccable dresses crossing the street toward black carriages gleaming in the moonlight. This is the London that official history likes to portray the city of progress, wealth, inventions, and great urban reform. But today I want to take you to a London that rarely appears in the gilded pages of books, a city hidden behind veils of fog, in cold, silent corners where the wind seems to carry secrets no one dares repeat aloud. It's not a story about princes, nor about proud industrialists. It's the story of those who lived on the margin, of those who woke every day not knowing if they would find a place to sleep the next night. A London where luxury and poverty coexisted side by side, separated only by a closed door or a block away. I want you to close your eyes and walk with, step by step, through these narrow streets where reality was too harsh to fit into novel. Yet at the same time so alive it seemed to breathe around you. Imagine yourself with me on a cold autumn night. The fog descends slowly, covering everything like a damp blanket. It's not white and light like the kind we see in rural landscapes. Here, it carries the heavy smell of burning coal, mixed with the odor of mud and open sewage. The distant sound of horse hoofs echoes through the cobblestone street, and every now and then, a tall, thin shadow quickly crosses your path, wrapped in a worn coat that has seen better days. This is how we begin our journey, not in the illuminated center, but in the dark fringes where few want to linger. I will speak to you as if you were right next to me, not in a rush, not in rapid-fire sentences, but at the pace of someone telling a story meant to be felt, not just heard. With every corner we turn, you will notice how the city changes, how the large, neatly lined houses give way to blackened tenements, where each window is a weary eye watching the passers. Here, on the ground, puddles reflect the flickering light of the street lamp, and the sound of footsteps can come from any direction, sometimes quiet, sometimes hurried to be safe. In the first person, I want you to feel the weight of living in this setting. I've walked these streets, I've breathed this air, I've felt the cold seep through the loose seams of my coat. I've seen the glances that quickly avert, as if ignoring you are a way of preserving one's own peace. And I've also seen the glances that linger, curious or sympathetic, as if trying to decipher an entire life just by the way you hold your shoulders or the slowness with which you shuffle your feet. Throughout this story, I will show you a city that pulsates beneath its shiny surface. I want you to hear the distant creak of a delivery cart, smell the scent of fresh bread escaping through a half-open bakery door. At the same time, perceive how that same rumor can become torture for those who have not a penny in their pocket. You will see beauty and sadness intertwined, like threads in an old fabric that, even worn, still holds a pattern of rare complexity. My invitation is simple. Walk with me slowly. We are not here to judge, nor to seek blame. We are here to understand, to see how it was possible to survive in a place where the distance between plenty and famine was less than the length of a street. With each step, we will cross invisible doors that separate completely different worlds. And in the end, perhaps you will understand that the true face of Victorian London lies not only in the encyclopedia engraving, but also in what lurked in the shadow. This is the story that begins on the riverbank but traverses the heart of the city. And if you're ready, let's move forward together and hurriedly, letting the night and the distant sound of bells guide us into this forgotten London, where every stone in the street holds a fragment of life that time has failed to erase. The city had a strange way of presenting itself, as if it carried two faces, each living under the same skin, yet barely touching. In the mornings, on the wide avenues near the Strand, or in the tree-lined squares of Bloomsbury, wealthy London showed itself in all its poise. Horses marched with measured steps, the metallic sound of their hoofs echoing against the pale stone facade. Shop windows gleamed with polished silver, fine fabrics, and leather-bound books. Ladies crossed the streets sheltered by delicate parasols, while gentlemen, impeccable in their dark overcoats, exchanged quick greetings as if the day were choreography rehearsed for generations. The air, at least here, seemed lighter, less smoky, as if the wind had learned to blow only where comfort resided. But all it took was to leave these streets and turn a narrow corner for the city's tone to change. The sounds were no longer clear, but muffled, mingled with the squeak of wheels on old carts and the distant cries of street vendors selling salted fish, charcoal, or crumpled newspaper. The sweet, heavy scent of flowers from the wealthy squares was quickly lost, replaced by a dense mixture of coal smoke, sweat, and the bitter-sweet odor of sewage running beneath iron. The facades no longer gleamed. The stone was darkened by time and soot, and the windows, when there was glass in them, were coated with a dust so ancient it seemed part of the street itself. It was like crossing an invisible border. A block ago, Coachmen guided their passengers with calculated kindness. Now, carters scolded in harsh voices, fighting for the narrow street, where skinny children squeezed in to carry packages in exchange for a few corn. In the tenement, worn clothes flapped in the wind, attached to ropes that spanned from one wall to the other. Each open door revealed, for a moment, a slice of compressed life, entire families sharing a single room, the air saturated with stove smoke and low conversation, sometimes interrupted by a dry cough that never subsided. I remember how this contrast hurt my eyes at first, before I got used to it. It was as if two cities looked at each other every day, never recognizing each other. The rich passed in carriages through the poorer street, staring straight ahead, as if it were just an inconvenient stretch between appointments. The poor, on the other hand, looked at the wealthy streets with a mixture of curiosity and resignation, as if they knew that life was close enough to see, but too far away to reach. At night, the difference became even more evident. In the prosperous areas, gas lamps glowed brightly, casting a golden light over the clean sidewalk. The sound of music drifted through the open windows of salons and tea houses. In the forgotten neighborhoods, the light thinned and shadows lengthened until they swallowed faces. The alleys were silent except for the crackling of wooden makeshift stoves and the whispered conversations of those preparing for another cold night. This was the London few wanted to see, but which was always there, glued to the other, like an imperfect reflection. The beauty of the squares and government buildings only seemed more flawless because someone, somewhere nearby, bore the weight of poverty. And I, walking between these two worlds, felt that neither was completely real without the other. Wealth was sustained by the invisibility of poverty, and poverty, strangely, kept alive the illusion that wealth was a natural state for it. Over time, I learned to hear the sounds of this duality. The clink of silver cutlery used to cut tender meats at private dinners. A few streets away, the sound of a dull knife scraping away the last piece of hardened bread. The intense rumor of coffee served in delicate, and the acidic smell of thin soup served in a line at the hostel. London was made of the opposites, and the more I saw them side by side, the more I understood that, for those who lived on the street, the bright part of the city was not a destination, it was just a constant reminder of how deep the sea old could reach. The first time I woke up on the streets of London, the world seemed different. It wasn't just the cold creeping through the seams of my coat, nor the damp weight of the fog that covered my shoulders like a wet cotton. It was the silence, a peculiar silence, filled with distant sounds that seemed to come from another city. At first, I couldn't understand where they were coming from: the echo of carriages, the pounding of hooves, the muffled shout of a newspaper vendor. It was as if I were behind thick glass, watching a world that went on without me. I was lying on a woodman bench near an alley, and the smell of the place already told me more about it than any map. It was a lingering mix of burnt coal, old sweat, and the bittersweet odor of food left over from the night before. Opening my eyes, I saw the uneven cobblestones, damp from the dew, and small patches of soot that seemed never to dissolve, no matter how much rain it fell. Above me, the sky was still dark, tinged with a grey light that came not from the sun, but from the street lamps that resisted the dawn. I got up slowly, feeling every joint ache. Sleeping on the streets isn't sleep, it's a succession of naps interrupted by nearby footsteps, unfamiliar coughs, and the constant fear that someone might approach with ill intention. Still, the body learns to rest amidst the restlessness. When I sat down, the cold seemed to intensify, as if taking advantage of the opening to penetrate deeper. I ran my hands over my knees, trying to warm them, and looked back down the alley from where I'd come. Two figures moved inside, wrapped in threadbare blankets. One of them glanced at me briefly, expressionless, before pulling the fabric up to cover his face. On the street, intimacy is rare, and every glance is measured. I started walking. The first rule was simple: get up early, before the shops opened and people from outside began to occupy the street. Shopkeepers didn't want to see figures like mine in their doorway. The police, with their long coats and wooden batons, also didn't hesitate to disperse anyone who had lingered too long. There was a certain ritual to this movement. As the day grew brighter, the homeless left the alleys, courtyards, and bridge arches like retreating shadow. As I rounded the first corner, I caught the scent of freshly baked bread coming from a bakery. It was early enough that the street was still quiet, and I could stand still for a moment, just taking in the scent. It mingled with the chilly air and carried a promise I knew I couldn't keep. Hunger in the morning was different. It wasn't an abrupt emptiness, like at the end of the day, but a gentle, persistent ache that reminded me every minute that nothing was guaranteed. The sun was slow to appear in the London winter, and until it did, the city seemed to live in shades of grey. The facades were shadows of themselves, the wet stones reflected flickering light, and the steam from the kitchens rose through the cracks in the windows, dissipating too quickly to warm those passing by. The sound of the first calls broke the silence, fishmongers announcing the freshness of their goods, carters shouting to make way. I walked slowly, not only out of fatigue, but because I knew there was no point in rushing. In the end, the day would stretch out in a single cycle, walking, searching for food, seeking shelter, surviving. Sometimes, passing by still clothes shop windows, I'd see my reflection in the glass, distorted by dust and condensation, a gaunt face, unshaven, sunken eyes. It was hard to connect that figure with the man I remembered being. And yet, there was something strange about it. On the streets, identity dissolves, but a part of you begins to mold itself to that environment, as if the city were slowly rewriting it. I walked to one of the public fountains where I could drink water. The metal was cold to the touch, and each sip felt like it was going through my entire body. For a moment, I watched the steam rise from my mouth and mingle with the air. Round me, others were already moving, adjusting blankets, packing away small belongings. There was no exchange of words. Communication was made through brief gestures, a wave, or the absence of. As I walked away, day finally began to dawn. The light wasn't golden, nor warm. It was pale, filtered by the mist, and seemed to carry a weight equal to that of the night. But there was something about it that kept me going. Perhaps it was the simple need to see another sunrise, or perhaps the certainty that, even in the harshness of the day, there was a strange beauty in watching the city awaken from the perspective of those who live in the shadows. The morning in London, for those who are homeless, begins with the body still heavy from a bad night's sleep and the cold ingrained in the bone. There's no slow, comfortable transition between sleep and wakefulness. It's as if the city itself is pushing you out of your rest, with sounds and smells that announce that the day won't wait. The bench where I lay down seemed harder than I remembered, and the board, still damp, stuck to the worn fabric of my coat. As I stood up, I felt my joints creak as if protesting another day like the last. The first task was simple and inevitable: move. On the streets, stillness invites discomfort. Movement helps you warm up, and at the same time, it wards off the stares that ask, albeit silently, what you're doing there. I walked slowly, as if each step were a way of convincing my body to move on. I passed the doors of still closed shops, smelled the sweet aroma of bread baking behind the walls, and heard the muffled sound of someone rearranging shelves. It was a world beginning to prepare itself for life, and for a while, I simply wandered through it, like a spectator. Then came the problem of finding something to eat. There were lucky days, when a vendor would leave out a stale loaf of bread, or when, near the market, you'd find a fallen apple, stained but still edible. Other times, you'd have to wait in line at a charity shop, where the soup was thin, almost translucent, but it warmed your stomach and offered a few minutes of respite. The problem was, these lines were long, and in the cold, they seemed even longer. As I waited, I observed the people round me, men with weather-beaten faces, women with children clinging to their skirts, young people who looked old for their age. Then came the work, if there was any, carrying sacks of coal, stacking crates in the market, sweeping courtyard. The pay was low, almost nothing, but every coin was precious. My arms ached at the end of the day, and sometimes my nails were black with soot. difficult to clean even when there was water. But the physical exhaustion was different from the exhaustion of doing nothing. Working, however hard, gave a brief sense of being connected to the rhythm of the city, of being part, however small, of something bigger. The clothes, already worn, required improvised care. On rainy days, the fabric took a long time to dry, and the moisture seemed to cling not only to my skin, but also to my mind. Sometimes I'd try washing a shirt in a basin of cold water, wringing it vigorously to remove the excess, but there was rarely a place to hang it to dry safely. The smell of cheap soap mingled with charcoal, and somehow the aroma became familiar, almost comforting. The routine also included finding shelter for the following night. It couldn't be decided until after sunset, as the safest spots under a canopy, near a lantern, inside an abandoned courtyard were photoed like gold. There were paid shelters, with hard beds and rough blankets, but there wasn't always enough money for it. When night fell, no matter how exhausted I was, I needed to be somewhere where I could close my eyes with a minimum of security. The day, then, was a sequence of small goals. Eat something, stay warm, work if possible, and secure a place to sleep. Between these tasks, there were moments of pause when I simply observed the city. I watched the trams pass by carrying men hurrying to work, heard the laughter of well-dressed children leaving school, smelled the scent of tobacco wafting from pub doors. And in those moments, I realized how London was a living organism, pulsing at different rhythms for each of its inhabitants. The daily grind wasn't just physical, but mental as well. It required monitoring one's thoughts to keep from sinking. There was something almost meditative in the simple act of walking the street, dodging puddles and feeling the uneven pavement beneath one's worn soul. The body learned to cope with discomfort, but the mind needed small anchors of fond memory. The phrase overheard, the simple pleasure of feeling the sun break through the fog and touch one's face for a few seconds. And so the days passed, one after the other, with slight variation, like chapters in a long, silent book. There was no rush, no major twists and turns, just the constancy of surviving, of following the city's awakening and falling asleep, knowing that, somehow, I was part of that invisible flow that sustained life in London. Even if no one noticed, there was a kind of constant alertness that became part, like an extra sense, always alert. On the streets of London, it wasn't enough to simply find food and a place to sleep. You had to be alert to whoever passed by, whoever approached, whoever seemed to be paying too much attention. Not that everyone was a threat, but the truth was that, most of the time, danger could be just a few steps away, disguised behind an indifferent face or a gesture that, at first glance, seemed banal. The police, known as peelers, walked with a firm step, their batons hanging low in their hands. They weren't always violent, but they had the authority to remove anyone they deemed inconvenient to the city's order. This meant that often, all it took was standing in the wrong place to be pushed into moving on. The unspoken advice among us was clear. Never stay in the same spot for too long, especially in busy areas. Being invisible was a skill, and I learned it quickly. The problem was that invisibility had its cost. It isolated. It prevented conversations from forming naturally. It made loneliness a constant, not by choice, but by survival. Still, there were times when their paths crossed more than once, and little by little, a mutual recognition was born. A tall man with a grey beard who always lingered near the docks. A thin woman with a blue headscarf who distributed horse laughter to anyone who would listen. They weren't friends in the traditional sense, but they were faces that, as the days passed, became familiar. These small connections were valuable, but never completely secure. The same man who offered you a piece of bread one day might try to steal your blanket the next. The rules were volatile, changing with hunger, cold, and fear. And yet, there were gestures that defied this logic. A shared spot by a makeshift fire, a whispered warning of an upcoming police raid, a piece of boiled potato shared in silence. These were brief moments, but they could make the night seem shorter. There was also the other kind of threat, those who didn't live on the street, but passed through them. Some were merely curious, watching as if we were on display in an invisible shop window. Others bore contempt, throwing insults or coins to the ground, not as help, but as humiliation. And then there were the most dangerous, those who came with gratuitous violence, for the sheer pleasure of exerting power over those who had no way to fight back. At such time, the instinct was to disappear, to vanish into the shadows before their footsteps got too close. The city, for all its grandeur, had many places to hide. Narrow alleys, bridge arches, abandoned warehouses. But the shelter that protected me from the wind could also trap the sound of footsteps, making it harder to hear anyone approaching. It was a delicate balance, seeking physical safety without sacrificing the security of being alert. I slept lightly, every sound amplified by my body, ready to move if something seemed amiss. Even so, social life on the streets existed in a curious way. There were no prearranged meetings, but there were spots where we inevitably crossed paths. The line for a nighttime soup, the courtyard behind a church, the corner of the market after the vendors had left. There, conversations would emerge, almost always beginning with comments about the weather or a rumor about work. We spoke little of the past. On the streets, yesterday had little value, tomorrow even less. It was the now that counted, the next step, the next meal, the next place to... There were nights when the city seemed calmer, and these encounters took on a different tone. Someone would tell a funny story about an absent-minded salesman. Another would recall a past winter when snow covered even the wheels of the car. At these times, the laughter sounded different. It wasn't light, but it wasn't fake either. It was the laughter of someone who knew that, despite everything, they could still find a moment of humanity amidst the hardship. The danger never completely disappeared. Even on quiet nights, there was the reminder that it only took a moment of carelessness to lose something important. So every conversation was brief, every bond fragile. Still, every voice heard, every glance recognized in the crowd, helped remind us that we weren't just shadows in the city. We were part of it, no matter how much the rest of the world pretended not to see. There was a kind of decision that seemed simple to those who had never lived on the street, but which, for us, carried enormous weight. It was the dilemma of whether or not to accept the work offered by the workhouse. From the outside, it seemed like a solutioner place with walls, food, and a bed, albeit a hard one. But inside, the workhouse had its own chains, invisible but tough. I remember the first time I stood at the gate, watching the movement. Men and women filed in, without speaking, as if crossing a threshold that dwarfed them. The work there wasn't just physical. It was a way to break the spirit. Carrying stones, separating old ropes, cleaning endless floors. Everything was done in heavy silence, watched by eyes that seemed to gauge how much dignity remained. Meals were calculated to keep the body upright, but never to satisfy. And there were rules, so many rules about schedule, posture, how and when to speak. Anyone who entered left their name on the outside, replaced by a number. Even their clothes were replaced by rough uniforms, all identical. Outside, work was a different kind of challenge. Carrying sacks of charcoal for vendors, stacking boxes in market, sweeping warehouses after the goods were sold. The pay was meager, sometimes just enough coins for a cheap meal or a dry corner to sleep that night. But at least on the streets, my body moved more freely. I could choose where to stop for a breather, who to talk to, when to finish. There were also temporary jobs, which came and went just as quickly. A tavern owner who needed someone to unload barrels. A fruit merchant who paid for help carrying crates to the wagon. On these occasions, the feeling of having something to do, even for a few hours, brought a different warmth. It wasn't just the money. It was the simple act of being busy, of feeling your muscles working, of hearing someone say good job before moving on with your life. But work, when it came, also carried risk. Some employers, aware of our situation, took advantage of it to pay less or delay payment. Some disappeared without even delivering what they had agreed to, and there was no one to complain to. Others made us work to exhaustion, as if fatigue were just another unimportant detail. I quickly learned that, on the streets, physical exertion wasn't the only price. There was always an internal negotiation about how much was worth giving in. There were days when I turned down jobs that would take me too far, knowing that upon returning, I'd lose the safe place I'd found to sleep. Other times, I accepted tasks simply to keep warm during the coldest hours, expecting no pay. Work, in the end, was part of survival, but also part of the invisible strategy each of us developed to get through the week. And there was a quiet pride in the days when you could work. Returning to the street with a few coins in your pocket, the world seemed less heavy, if only for a short time. The hunger seemed less, the cold less sharp, and, for a moment, I could feel less invisible, as if I had regained, however briefly, the right to be part of the city's movement. But at night, when the streets emptied and the mist once again enveloped the street lamp, the truth remained. The next day, it would all begin again, and the dilemma, with all its promises and pitfalls, would be there to wait. As constant as the cold and hunger was a silent but constant presence, following me like a stubborn shadow. It wasn't just the emptiness in my stomach, it was a sensation that spread throughout my entire body, leaving my muscles sluggish, my head heavier, and my thoughts cloudier, it would appear. Soon after waking, when my body realized that the little I'd eaten the day before had already been converted into unspent energy. At first, I tried to ignore it, sipping cold water to trick my stomach, but soon it would return, more insistent, as if reminding me that nothing was more urgent than finding something to eat. The smell of the city made the search more difficult. Passing a bakery early in the morning, test of entrance, the aroma of freshly baked bread drifted out into the street like an invitation I couldn't accept, and for a moment, I found myself imagining the crisp texture of the crust and the soft warmth of the crust. In the market, the sight of stacked fruit, hanging meats, and cheeses ranged carefully on the counters was at once beautiful and cruel. I didn't need menus to know what desire was. It was before me, in vivid colors and scents that awakened every hungry fiber of my body. There were places where charities offered soup or bread, small institutions run by churches or by citizens willing to help. But these lines were long, and often there wasn't enough food for everyone. I learned to arrive early, to recognize the sound of doors opening, to read the street activity that announced the distribution. When I was lucky, I'd receive a bowl of thin broth, hot enough to warm my hands and stomach. It wasn't tasty, but in that moment, taste hardly mattered. It was warmth. It was sustenance. On unlucky days, all that was left was to scavenge for scraps after the markets closed. What remained were bruised fruit, wilted leaves, and stale pieces of bread. Sometimes a familiar vendor would quickly hand me something, without saying a word, just to ensure I wouldn't be left empty-handed. These were small gestures, however discreet, carried immense weight. At other times, I had to fight for these scraps with other hungry people, and this struggle, however silent, always left its mark, not physically, but on the soul. There was also the riskier option, taking jobs in exchange for food, hauling a barrel down to a tavern's basement, unloading sacks of flour at a bakery, cleaning a yard. Payment came in the form of a hot meal, and for a few hours afterward, hunger would recede, almost as if it had forgotten me. It was strange how a piece of meat or a generous slice of bread could change the way I saw the city. The streets seemed brighter, the cold less biting. But hunger always returned, and when it did, it didn't come alone. It brought with it a profound tiredness, a silent irritation, a sadness that crept in without warning. I learned to walk slowly to conserve energy, to speak little to conserve strength. My body developed a kind of economy of its own, and each gesture was calculated to last until the next meal, which could come in a few hours or even the next day. At night, lying in a corner, the sounds of the city seemed to amplify my hunger. The distant clatter of cutlery, the clinking of glasses in a pub, someone's laughter after a hearty dinner. Everything reminded me of what I didn't have. Yet, even in the midst of this emptiness, there was a strange calm. Perhaps it was my body resigning itself. Perhaps it was my mind trying to preserve some fragment of peace. I closed my eyes and imagined flavors, like someone lighting a candle to ward off the darkness, not because it illuminated everything, but because, for a few moments, it made me believe that the next day could be different. The rhythm of the city, for those who live on its fringes, is like music heard outside a dance hall. The notes rise, but always muffled, distorted, as if there were an invisible wall between you and the place where things really happen. In the morning, when the streets are still thick with fog, I see the first workers leaving their homes with determined steps, hats adjusted and coats buttoned. There's a purpose in their walk, as if every movement was already planned before the day even began. I, on the other hand, walk at the pace the streets allow, following the flow only as far as it will take me. From my perspective, the city isn't just made up of buildings and avenues, but of micro-stories that repeat themselves every day. The same lady who opens the fabric store with a weary sigh, the young apprentice who rushes to catch up, balancing a basket of warm bread, the coachman who exchanges a few quick words with a friend before reining in and continuing on his way. I observe these moments like someone reading a book from afar, unable to touch the pages. They are scenes that don't belong to me, but that, somehow, help to compose the landscape of my own existence. There's a curious thing about living on this side of the city. Time expands. For those with fixed commitments, schedule, the hours seem to fly by. For me, they stretch out like the dragging of a low bell. Walking down streets where nothing is meant for me creates a kind of detachment. I can spend half an hour standing on the corner of a market, just listening to the conversations, smelling the spices mixed with fresh fish and charcoal. It's almost like being inside a living painting, where everything moves, but nothing really touches. As the day progresses, the city speeds up. The wheels of the carts turn faster, the vendors' calls grow louder, and the sound of footsteps mingles with voices discussing prices, deals, and meetings. In this environment, I learned to move like water, dodging between bodies, avoiding attention, but absorbing every fragment of this rhythm. It's a dance that demands attention, because one wrong move is all it takes to bump into someone who doesn't want to be disturbed or find yourself in the path of an impatient god. The curious thing is that, even living on the margin, you begin to recognize the pattern. You know that, round noon, certain streets will be busier and others emptier. You know that the rush of those heading out for lunch is different from the rush of those already late for work. You learn to recognize, simply by the way they walk, who is carrying cash in their pockets and who, like you, is counting coin. It's a knowledge that doesn't appear on maps or in guidebooks, but that is etched deep into your memory. As the afternoon begins to draw to a close, the city changes its tone. The shadows lengthen, and the rumble of wheels and footsteps is gradually replaced by denser sounds, doors closing, windows being locked, heavy carts carrying goods back to the warehouses. It's a moment when I feel the border become clearer. Those with somewhere to go quicken their pace, eager to reach the warmth of their home. I, on the other hand, slow down. For me, night-time doesn't mean rest, but rather a search for safety, for warmth, for a piece of land I can call my own until dawn. Observing the rhythm of the city, day after day, is to realize that London is like a vast organism, each part moving according to its own rule. I am like a loose cell, floating in the current, with no defined function, yet still a part of this body. And perhaps that is what sustains me, the strange sensation that, even without a set destination, I still walk within the same music, even if it reaches me softly and distantly, as if coming through the mist. Over time, you begin to notice that, even on the streets, there are faces that repeat themselves. At first, they go unnoticed, like shadows that cross your path without leaving a trace. But after a few days, or weeks, familiarity sets in almost imperceptibly. He's the man who always sits on the edge of the bridge, wrapped in a green coat darkened by time. He's the woman who appears every morning near the market, her flowered scarf hiding part of her face. He's the boy who runs with a sack of rags on his back, always disappearing before dusk. Between us, there are rarely formal introductions. No one says their name as they would at a dinner table. What unites us is not who we were before, but the fact that we are here, now, sharing the same street corners and the same cold wind. There is a kind of silent language that develops in this coexistence: a quick nod, a glance that indicates approaching danger, a discreet gesture pointing to where, that night, there might be a dry corner. These exchanges are brief, but charged with meaning, as if each movement says more than words could. These small, makeshift communities are unlike the neighborhoods the rest of the city knows. There are no fences, marked streets, or fixed commitment. No one owns anything, and yet there's a kind of tacit respect for the spaces and the stories each. Round the makeshift campfire, it's possible to hear fragments of past lives. A man who once worked on the docks, a woman who lost her family to fever, a young man who ran away from home and never returned. These narratives emerge and disappear like a flame dancing in the cold air, warming for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. It's curious how, even in the absence of formal ties, the need to belong persists. There are nights when I find myself with 3 or 4 people, sharing a piece of stale bread or some weak tea. The silence, in those moments, isn't uncomfortable. It's a shelter. We don't need to convince ourselves of anything, nor tell stories that aren't true. It's simply being there, breathing the same air, observing the same patch of sky that opens up between the tall buildings and the chimney. Of course, not all encounters are pleasant. Sometimes, fear or hunger causes someone to cross that invisible line of respect, taking something that isn't theirs or occupying a space already marked by someone else. These ruptures create fissures that are quick, but almost always fleeting. Tomorrow, these same people might be side by side again, because, deep down, there's nowhere to run. The city may be big, but for those who live on the street, the available spaces are few, and sooner or later we all cross paths again. There's a night I remember as a silent portrait of this kind of connection. The wind blew sharply from the east, bringing the salty scent of the Thames. I sat under a stone arch with 2 other men and a woman. We didn't say much. Someone took a lump of coal from their pocket and placed it on the makeshift fire to keep it going. The heat was weak, but enough to keep our hands less stiff. On each of our faces, the flickering light cast deep shadow. We sat there for hours, staring into the fire, and every now and then exchanging a quiet comment about the night or a rumor that a nearby church would open its doors on Sunday to serve soup. These nights aren't recorded in documents or newspapers, but they shape the lives of those who live on the margin. It's in these moments that we remember that, despite everything, we still belong somewhere, even if that place is just a shared space in silence, in the cold, alongside people like you. Have learned to survive where the city prefers to look. The danger on London streets wasn't always glaring. It didn't always come with hurried footsteps or raised voices. Often, it approached silently, like the mist that descended upon the city at nightfall. It was a diffused presence, lingering in the air and seeping into the hours, reminding me that there, beneath the grey sky and blackened facade, I was vulnerable to everything and everyone. It didn't matter if I was standing on a busy street corner or huddled in a dark alley. There was always the awareness that any carelessness could cost me dearly. The streets were lively, but also unpredictable. At any moment, someone could appear, not always with good intention. Some of these figures carried an unexplainable rage, an aggression that seemed born more from the world itself than from any specific motive. All it took was a moment's lingering gaze to create reason for confrontation. So I learned early on to lower my eye, to keep walking, to offer neither curiosity nor challenge to others. But it wasn't just direct violence that threatened. There was also the sneaky theft, the hand reaching out too quickly, taking a coin, a piece of bread, or even the blanket that kept me. Often, the thief was another homeless person, someone as desperate as I was. And that's when the danger became most severe. It came not only from outside, but also from within the small community that, at times, seemed to be the only refuge. It was hard to hold a grudge when you knew that hunger could transform anyone. At night, the feeling of exposure grew. Long shadows hid passes, and the silence between one noise and the next could be more unsettling than the footsteps themselves. The creaking of wood, the sound of glass breaking in the distance, a drawn-out laugh, all these sounds gained weight in the darkness. Sometime I would move in the middle of the night, taking with me what little I had, simply because a hunch told me that staying would be dangerous. At such time, instinct was more reliable than any logical explanation. There was also the less visible but equally constant threat, illness. A poorly cared for cut, a cough that dragged on for weeks, a chill that settled in the bones and seemed to refuse to leave. On the streets, any weakness was an invitation for danger to approach. Someone weakened couldn't react as quickly, nor protect themselves with the same attention. And often, the city itself seemed indifferent to these signs, going about its business while some of us quietly disappeared, nameless and heard of. I remember one night in particular, lying under the arch of a bridge. The sound of the river mingled with the wind, and for a moment I almost managed to relax. Then I heard slow, heavy footsteps that stopped too close. I held my breath, feeling my heart pound in my chest. There was nothing to protect me, only darkness and the hope that whoever it was would move on. After a few seconds that felt like minutes, the footsteps resumed their path, moving away. Only then did I realize my hands were trembling. Over time, danger stops being a visitor and becomes a companion. You learn to move with it, to calculate it in every decision, to accept it as part of the air you breathe. And, strangely, this constant awareness doesn't make you lighter. It just teaches you that to survive, you must always be ready to leave, always ready to disappear into the same fog that covers the city every night. The seasons shape street life in ways few could imagine. They weren't just changes in the weather or landscape, but profound transformations in the rhythm of each day, in the body, in mood, and even in the way the city breathed. Winter, above all, was the greatest. When temperatures dropped, London's humidity seemed to seep into everything, as if the fog itself carried tiny needles of ice. No matter how many layers of clothing you wore, the cold always found a way in, lodging in your bones and slowing every movement. At night, the wind whistled through the narrow street, lifting old papers and scattering ashes from makeshift fires. I remembered how, in their home, people would huddle close to the fire, drawing their curtains against the freezing air. In the streets, we huddled together, sharing warm blankets and human warmth, trying to find a patch of wall to block the wind. Sleep, in winter, was shallow and restless. The body would fall asleep only to be awakened shortly afterward by the pain of stiff fingers or the sensation that our noses and ears were about to freeze. Spring, on the other hand, arrived like a sigh. The air was still chilly, but there was a distinct freshness to it, a silent promise of better days ahead. The mornings brought a damp, earthy scent and flowers beginning to bloom in the public garden. I noticed more children on the street, more lively conversations in the market, more brief smiles, even to strangers. For us, it was a time when the nights became less dangerous and when the simple sensation of warmth on our faces at midday could change on them. Summer, though seen as a blessing, had its own pitfall. The heat made the city's smells more intense, the stench of sewage, the sweat of the crowds, the mix of spices and smoke from street vendors. Public fountains became more crowded, and finding shade was almost as difficult as finding shelter in winter. Still, there was a certain relief in being able to sleep without fear of waking stiff from the cold. The warm nights allowed for longer conversations and even occasional laughter, as if, for a few weeks, the entire city breathed more lightly. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the streets with dry leaves that accumulated in the gutters. The wind carried a slightly sweet aroma of burning wood, wafting from the houses where fireplaces were being rekindled for us. It was a warning that the cycle was about to begin again, that winter would once again demand more entrance. I felt the weight of this transition. The nights grew colder, and the days shorter, making daylight hours precious for securing food, some money, above all, a safe place to retreat. Over time, I realized that life on the streets was, in many ways, a constant conversation with the season. Each one brought its own challenges and required small adaptation, like changing rest stops, adjusting our schedule, or finding new temporary allies. There was a silent respect for this cycle, almost as if the city and we were locked in the same rhythm, breathing together, albeit in such different ways. And perhaps that was what kept hope alive, however small, the certainty that nothing was fixed, not even the biting cold of January or the suffocating heat of July. Everything passed, and with patience, the body and mind learned to navigate each change. Surviving, in the end, also meant learning to listen to the murmur of the seasons and walk alongside them, step by step, as London continued, tirelessly, to turn in its own time. Health, for those living on the streets of London, was like a weak flame flickering in the wind. It could disappear at any moment. There was no protection from the cold by wall, nor the certainty of a hot meal to strengthen the body. Any cut, any cold, any pain that for others would be merely a temporary inconvenience could become a serious threat to us. I learned early on that, in our condition, time was both an ally and an enemy. If illness arrived, it needed to leave quickly, before it had time to take root. At that time, city medicine wasn't easily accessible. There were doctors, yes, but their services cost more than many weeks of hard work. At best, we were left with hospices run by religious or philanthropic institutions, where medical students practiced or volunteer nurses administered simple remedies. I remember one time when a wound on my arm, caused by a piece of glass, began to fester. The pain spread to my shoulder, and I knew I needed help. I walked to one of these places, a small building with a strong smell of disinfectant and coal smoke. A woman in a white coat cleaned the cut with boiled water and wrapped it with a clean cloth. It was quick, almost mechanical, but for me, it was like receiving a gift. But such luck wasn't always possible. Often, care was improvised. We used old cloths as bandages, newspapers to keep warm, and herbal teas bought in bulk at the market as a remedy for a persistent cough. Faith in small tricks passed from one person to another. Honey to soothe the throat, dissolved salt to clean wounds, hot steam to aid breathing. These were fragile solutions, but when nothing else was available, even temporary relief was valuable. The most insidious illnesses were those that came slowly. A cough that lasted weeks, a fatigue that never went away, a fever that always returned. I've known men who simply went to bed one night and never got up again. The cold, humidity, and malnutrition took their toll silently, and the city didn't stop to notice. The weakened body was easy ground for any illness to take hold. There was also the silent fear of outbreak. When rumors of typhoid or smallpox spread through the streets, tension grew. We had no way to isolate ourselves, nor resources for adequate treatment. In these times, some would suddenly disappear, taken to public hospitals where they were kept out of sight, and often never returned. Despite this, there was a spirit of care among those who shared the same floor. When someone fell ill, the others, as much as possible, shared food, blanket, or simply stayed nearby, keeping watch at night to ensure no one took advantage of the other's vulnerability. These were small gestures, but filled with humanity. I remember lying helpless for days in the corner of a makeshift shelter and receiving, without asking, a mug of hot tea brought by a man I barely knew. We exchanged no words, silence sufficed. This was the reality. Health was a fragile commodity, and medicine a distant luxury. Survival meant caring for oneself with the simplest resources and relying, occasionally, on the silent generosity of those who knew that, the next day, they might be in the same situation. London continued to spin indifferently, but within the shadows, we found ways to keep the flame burning for another day. There's a particular silence that hangs over anonymous deaths. It's not the same respectful silence that surrounds a funeral with flowers, speeches, and shared memories. It's a cold, almost indifferent silence that blends into the rhythm of the city and disappears into it as if nothing had happened. Living on the streets is knowing that, sooner or later, someone you know or at least recognize will disappear, and there will be no announcement, no farewell, no record to tell that. I remember a man I saw every night on the same corner, near a bakery. I never learned his name. Sometimes we'd exchange a wave or a murmur about the weather. One morning, passing by the same spot, I found the space empty except for a dirty piece of cloth, probably used as a blanket. No one commented, no one explained. It was simply gone. That's how it was. One day present, the next absent. When death arrived visibly, the ritual was simple and brief. A public transport van, used to collect bodies, was accompanied by 2 or 3 men, working with quick, automatic movement. There were no tears, no familiar faces following behind. The body was placed on a stretcher, covered with a rough cloth, and taken wherever needed. The destination, almost always, was a mass grave. Paupers' graves, as they were called. No headstone, no name. Just a number written in a book few would read. Mass graves were large holes dug on the outskirts of the city. There, bodies were deposited side by side, separated only by a thin layer of earth before the next was placed. Everything was done efficiently, without ceremony. There were days when the wind carried the distant scent of these places twice, and it was impossible not to think that perhaps one day one's own body would end up there, mixed in with so many others, its identity unknown. The hardest part wasn't thinking about death itself, but the oblivion that accompanied it. The stories, the memories, the unique gestures of each person were erased as if they had never existed. It was as if the city, large and full of life, had the ability to absorb these absences without ever losing its pace. Life went on. The carts still passed. The shops opened their doors. The smell of fresh bread still wafted through the street. And the one who had departed became just another shadow among many. But among us, there were discreet attempts to resist this oblivion. When someone died, and there were those who knew something about them, a story would be told by the campfire, or during the soup kitchen. A kind gesture, a funny phrase, a memorable episode would be remembered. There were no monuments or headstones, but there was a shared memory, and for a moment, the name that was rarely spoken would once again exist in the air. It was small, but it was real. I carry these stories with me like small objects tucked away in my pocket. I remember voices, laughter, glance. I know the world won't remember them, but as long as I do, they won't be completely lost. And perhaps that's all there is to offer in life on the street. The silent promise not to let the other disappear without even being thought of once more. There comes a moment, as night falls and the city begins to quiet down, when the mind finds space to ponder the meaning of dignity. It's a heavy, almost abstract word, but on the street it becomes something very concrete. It's not about clean clothes or honorable title. It's something more subtle, almost invisible, that lives in the way you stare at your own reflection in a foggy window, or the way you hold your posture even when your stomach is empty. Resistance begins in the detail. It's getting up in the morning, even after a night of barely any sleep, and still running your hands through your hair, straightening your coat, brushing the dust off your pants. It's refusing to completely lose self-care, because if you do, the city begins to swallow you whole in a way that's irreversible. It's knowing that, despite everything, there's still an intact core within you that doesn't belong on the street, no matter how long you live there. Resistance often means remaining calm in the face of the cold gaze of others. There are those who pass by and look as if you were part of the scenery, a pebble on the sidewalk or a lamppost. There are also those who hurriedly look away, as if avoiding eye contact were a way of denying their existence. It is in these moments that dignity hides in something almost imperceptible, not letting your own worth depend on the recognition of others. Knowing that who you are cannot be measured by the haste or contempt of passers. There are days when resistance is silent and almost invisible. It's saying no to humiliating work. Even knowing the coins it would earn would make a difference. It's saving a piece of bread for someone in an even worse situation, even if it means going hungry again. It's protecting, in some way, that which reminds us that we are human, not just survivors. But resilience also manifests itself in the desire to continue. There are nights when the cold seems sharper, and each breath is a blade piercing your chest. There are days when the rain never stops, and your entire body aches with dampness. And yet, when dawn rises, you rise and begin again. Not out of heroism, nor any noble ideal, but because there is something deep and instinctive that drives you forward, as if life itself refuses to be extinguished. Over time, I realized that dignity and resilience go hand in hand, and that they don't depend on ideal circumstances to exist. They thrive, in fact, amidst the most hostile. Perhaps that's why, even in extreme poverty, you see gestures of courtesy, care, and even pride. A man who polished his own shoes, even when they were worn down to the fabric. A woman who spent hours hand-sewing the tear in her only dress. Small ritual to the outside world might have seemed insignificant, but which, to us, were proof that there was still a core within us that could not be taken. And when I think about it, I realize that the city, with all its contrasts and indifference, cannot truly destroy those who maintain this core. It can tire, harden. It can even take almost everything. But dignity, that silent flame that endures even when nothing else remains. And it is this that allows us, at the end of each day, to look at ourselves and know that we are still more than the sum of our circumstances. When I look back and reflect on everything I experienced on the streets of London, I realize there's something time can't erase. The quiet courage hidden in every gesture of daily life. It wasn't the heroic courage seen in books, made up of fiery speeches and grandiose deeds. It was a humble, almost invisible courage that manifested itself in the simple decision to get up each morning, to put one foot in front of the other, even when there was no certainty of where to go or what to find. Life there lacked the romantic beauty many like to imagine when they speak of Victorian London. There was no constant golden light on the street, no soft melody accompanying the evening. The alleys were cold, damp, and often dangerous. The buildings, tall and blackened with soot, seemed to watch from above, indifferent to what was happening below. And yet, there was something deeply human about that forgotten space. Amidst the harshness, moments of sharing emerged. Small acts of kindness, though rare, were precious. The stories told about this period, full of elegant carriages and brightly lit salons, failed to capture the weight of survival that fell upon so many. They don't depict the calloused hand, the chill in the bone, the empty stomach that became a constant companion. They don't speak of the silent goodbyes when someone disappeared, nor of the nights spent awake, not from lack of sleep, but from fear of what might happen if one's eyes closed. But if the truth is harsh, it also carries a kind of beauty few perceive. It's the beauty of knowing that, even when all seemed lost, there was still muffled left around a makeshift campfire. It's the beauty of seeing a loaf of bread divided into four, when it would have been easier to keep it for oneself. It's the knowing look between two strangers who meet and recognize in each other the same silent struggle. Over time, I learned that courage wasn't just about enduring, but about preserving something inside that the street couldn't destroy. A thought, a memory, a piece of hope held like a treasure. This inner reserve, not measured in coins or possession, was what kept us going. It was what reminded us that, even though the city tried to reduce us to shadows, we were still people with story, feelings, dignity. And perhaps this is the true legacy of those who lived on that side of Victorian London. Proof that human beings are capable of endurance not just out of necessity, but out of conviction. The conviction that life itself, however fragile it may seem, deserves to be defended one day at a time. If someone asks me today about those years, I don't just speak of misery and abandonment. I speak of resistance, resilience, and the silent courage that hid in every face that walked beside me. Because, in the end, that's what survived. Not the city that ignored us, not the hardships that crushed us, but the flame that kept burning, even on the coldest night, even when no one seemed to see it. And that flame, weak, flickering, but alive, is what I carry with me to this day, as a memory and as a promise that, as long as there are those who walk the street, there will also be those who keep within themselves something that not even the harshest of cities will be able to extinguish.